I did not walk into the office that morning looking for an escape. I went in to slam the door on a man who built his career by stealing my work. When I dropped my resignation on his desk, my manager leaned back and laughed, convinced I had just ruined my life, but that laugh died the second he opened the charcoal folder. It held proof of his theft and enough leverage to permanently destroy his promotion pitch that morning. I am Harper Chapman, and I can tell you exactly what a storm smells like before it breaks. It was one of those suffocating Houston mornings where the air felt like a hot, wet towel wrapped tightly around your throat. The sky outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of Halcyon Field Services was a bruised, heavy purple, threatening a torrential downpour that would likely flood the lower highways by noon. Halcyon was a behemoth in the disaster recovery sector. We were the people cities called when hurricanes ripped the roofs off subdivisions or when unexpected freezes burst pipes across 3 states. We managed fleets of contractors, negotiated with panicked local governments, and untangled the massive logistical nightmares that Mother Nature left behind. From the outside, we looked like saviors in high-visibility vests. On the inside, Halcyon was a shark tank. It was an environment that rewarded those who could claim credit the loudest, regardless of who actually did the heavy lifting. I had spent my entire adult life trying to be the person who did the lifting, mistakenly believing that the weight of my work would speak for itself. I had been naive. The air conditioning on the executive floor hummed loudly, trying to fight back the Houston humidity, but it always felt heavy and hostile up here. I stepped off the elevator onto the executive floor precisely at 8:45 in the morning. I carried a minimalist leather tote bag over my shoulder and held a paper cup of black coffee that had gone completely cold because I had not taken a single sip. In my other hand, pressed firmly against my side, was a thick, charcoal gray folder. Its edges were lined with perfectly aligned, brightly colored tabs. The folder in my hand was heavy, weighing perhaps 2 or 3 pounds, but to me, it felt like an anvil. It was the physical manifestation of months of silent outrage, meticulous record-keeping, and cold calculation. I had spent the last 48 hours holed up in my apartment, cross-referencing every single document. I made sure that every timestamp on every email thread was legible, and that every financial discrepancy regarding the contractor payouts was highlighted in unmistakable neon yellow. This was not a folder born out of a sudden fit of rage. It was a carefully prepared final move. My heels clicked against the polished marble floor, a steady, rhythmic metronome, cutting through the hushed, climate-controlled silence of the corridor. I did not look at the executive assistants pretending to type while watching me from the corners of their eyes. I kept my gaze locked straight ahead on the corner glass office at the end of the hall. That office belonged to Trent Lasker, my direct manager. It was a monument to corporate vanity. It had the best view of the Houston skyline, massive leather sofas that no one ever sat on, and a desk large enough to land a small aircraft on. Trent was 46 years old, wore suits that cost more than some of our field technicians made in 2 months, and possessed the kind of effortless charisma that masked a profound lack of actual operational knowledge. Through the thick, soundproof glass, I could see him standing in front of the window, practicing his posture. He was adjusting the cuffs of his tailored shirt, speaking animatedly to an empty room, gesturing with the smooth, practiced confidence of a man who believed the world owed him its undivided attention. At 11 o'clock this morning, Trent was scheduled to walk into the executive boardroom and deliver the pitch that would secure his internal promotion to regional vice president. As I watched him rehearse, I noted the way he emphasized his words. He was practicing the exact lies he was going to tell about the operational systems I had sacrificed my nights and weekends to build. I pushed the heavy glass door open without knocking. Trent stopped mid-sentence, his hands dropping to his sides. His brow furrowed in a brief flash of annoyance before smoothing out into that condescending, camera-ready smile he reserved for subordinates. "Harper," he said, checking his heavy silver wristwatch. "We do not have a one-on-one scheduled for this morning. In fact, I am prepping for the board. Whatever operational fire is burning in the field right now, you need to handle it yourself." I walked directly to his massive mahogany desk. I did not sit in the low, uncomfortable guest chair designed to make visitors feel small. I stood tall, looked him dead in the eyes, and placed a single, crisp white sheet of paper squarely in the center of his blotter. My hands were entirely steady. There was no tremor in my fingers, no waver in my breath. "I am not here to put out your fires, Trent," I said, my voice quiet and utterly flat, cutting through his annoyance. "I am here to tell you that today is my last day at Halcyon. I am resigning, effective immediately. I decided to walk out today while I still have my self-respect intact, rather than stay and watch you strip it away piece by piece." Trent stared at the paper for a long second. Then, he leaned back in his high-backed leather chair and let out a sharp, genuine bark of laughter. He shook his head, running a hand over his perfectly styled hair, acting as though I had just delivered the punchline to a brilliant joke. "You are throwing a tantrum," he chuckled, picking up the resignation letter with 2 fingers as if it were a soiled napkin. "You are trying to play psychological games right before my big meeting because you feel underappreciated. It is a cute strategy, Harper, but it is deeply unprofessional." "It is a formal resignation," I replied, my expression unchanging. Trent dropped the paper back onto the desk and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the wood. The amused smile vanished, replaced by a cold, hard sneer. "Let us be completely realistic here. You are a smart girl, Harper, but you are not irreplaceable. You think you can just march in here and disrupt my morning? If you walk out that door, you will not find another firm in this entire state that will pay you $115,000 a year with the benefits package you have here. You think the board cares about your hurt feelings? They do not. No one in this industry listens to an overly sensitive mid-level employee who cannot handle the heat of the big leagues. You will be blacklisted before you reach the parking garage." He was trying to shrink me. It was the same tactic he used every time I pushed back against his narrative. But his words, which might have stung a year ago, now felt completely hollow. I reached into my tote bag and pulled out the thick, charcoal gray folder. It hit the mahogany wood with a heavy, satisfying thud. I placed my hand flat on top of it and slowly slid it across the polished surface until it rested right next to his keyboard. "That letter," I said, pointing to the single sheet of paper, "is just page 1. It is the easiest thing you will read today. The rest of this folder is what you really need to review before you step into that meeting with the executive board in 2 hours." Trent looked at the folder. His sneer faltered just a fraction. He looked back up at me, trying to read my face, searching for a bluff. Finding nothing but absolute resolve, he reached out and flicked open the heavy cover. He turned past the cover letter and stared at the neatly printed table of contents. I watched his eyes scan the bolded headers. I knew exactly what he was reading. Section 1 was titled Authorship Timeline. It contained every original time-stamped code, commit, private server log, and personal email draft, proving I had designed and built the entire operational matrix he was about to present as his own brainchild. Section 2 was titled Vendor Conflict Chain. This was the section that moved the situation from simple intellectual property theft into the realm of severe corporate liability. Section 3 read Altered KPI Reports, documenting exactly how he had manipulated the performance data of his favored subcontractors. Section 4 was the outside counsel receipt, confirming that an independent legal advisor had already reviewed the enclosed contractual breaches. And the final tab, glowing in a fluorescent yellow, was labeled Audit Committee Delivery Confirmation. It took exactly 4 seconds for the reality of those words to process in his brain. I counted them in my head. 1, 2, 3, 4. In that 4th second, the color drained completely from Trent Lasker's face. The arrogant flush in his cheeks vanished, leaving his skin the color of wet ash. His mouth parted slightly, but no sound came out. The laughter was dead and buried. He stared at the delivery confirmation receipt, realizing that every single piece of damning evidence in this folder was not just sitting on his desk. It had already been independently verified and securely transmitted to the people who held his career in their hands. His breathing turned shallow. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and suddenly stripped of all power. He was a man watching the floor collapse beneath his feet. Realizing too late that he had handed me the sledgehammer, I did not stay to watch him scramble. I did not need to hear his excuses, his threats, or his inevitable begging. The victory was not in his reaction. The victory was in the execution. "Good luck with your promotion pitch, Trent," I said softly. I turned on my heel and walked out of the glass office. I pulled the heavy door shut behind me, sealing him inside his own destruction. As I walked back down the hushed corridor, leaving the executive floor behind me, I felt a strange, profound sense of weightlessness. The storm outside finally broke, rain lashing fiercely against the thick windows, washing the glass clean. To understand how a woman like me, a dedicated, hard-working operational analyst who only ever wanted to do a good job, became the architect of such a cold, calculated, and absolute corporate execution, you cannot look at today. You have to rewind the tape. You have to go back exactly 2 years. Back to the moment I first believed that competence was enough to keep you safe. I did not learn how to dismantle a man's career in a corporate leadership seminar. I learned the mechanics of cause and effect in a modest, single-story house with faded vinyl siding in Springfield, Missouri. My father was a commercial electrician. He spent his days pulling thick, heavy copper wires through the dusty drywall of half-built strip malls and industrial parks. He would come home long after the streetlights flickered on, his hands heavily calloused, his boots scuffed white with plaster dust, and his clothes smelling permanently of ozone and hard labor. My mother was the bookkeeper for a local, fiercely independent hardware distributor. She spent her evenings sitting at our scratched laminate kitchen table, a heavy 10-key calculator clacking rhythmically under her fingers as she balanced paper ledgers down to the final, absolute penny. They were good, honest, working-class people who operated on a very simple, deeply ingrained American philosophy: you put your head down, you do the work correctly the very first time, and eventually, the world will reward your quiet diligence. They taught me that competence was a shield that would protect you from the unpredictable whims of the world. They believed that the cream always rises to the top without needing to shout about it. They were wrong, of course, but I carried that beautiful, naive belief with me for a very long time. It formed the bedrock of my entire worldview. I took that quiet, relentless work ethic to Oak Haven State, a solidly average, heavily bricked public university where absolutely nobody cared who your parents were, what kind of car you drove, or where you summered. I majored in operations analysis, a field most of my peers found brutally dry, because I found a strange, profound comfort in the raw honesty of logistics. While other students were drawn to the flashy, loud, and highly subjective worlds of marketing or high finance, I was endlessly fascinated by bottlenecks. I loved looking at a massive, chaotic, failing system and hunting for that single, tangled thread that was choking the life out of the entire process. I graduated a full year early, intentionally bypassing the fraternity parties and the superficial networking mixers. I walked off the campus armed with a heavy degree and an absolute, unwavering certainty that if I just kept fixing broken things, my value to any organization would be undeniable. At 23 years old, I walked into the soaring, glass-fronted lobby of Halcyon Field Services. I was hired as a field coordinator, which was an aggressively sanitized corporate title for professional, high-stakes chaos management. My job was to sit in a sprawling, humming cubicle farm on the 4th floor and try to impose some semblance of order on the immediate aftermath of devastating natural disasters. When a Category 4 hurricane flattened a coastal town in Louisiana, or when straight-line winds ripped the roofs off a subdivision in Florida, I was the one staring at 4 monitors, trying to make the math work. I was the one routing the heavy excavation machinery, scheduling the highly specialized technical crews, tracking down obscure local building permits in rural counties where the courthouses had just lost their own roofs, and frantically sourcing emergency roofing supplies when the regional supply chain was snapping in half. From my very first month, I was never the loudest voice in the morning stand-up meetings. I did not possess the polished, glad-handing charm that got people invited to exclusive executive happy hours or golf outings. But I saw the tiny, critical things that everyone else glossed over in their rush to look busy. I noticed when a mid-level manager accidentally assigned a crew of structural carpenters to a flooded basement job that actually required hazardous mold remediation specialists. I saw the overlapping, nonsensical travel routes that were burning through thousands of dollars in wasted diesel fuel and costing us precious daylight. I caught the tiny, seemingly insignificant typographical errors in municipal permit applications that I knew would sit on a hostile county clerk's desk and delay our entire cleanup effort by 3 solid weeks if they were not corrected before they went out the door. I did not speak up to show off or to score points with the bosses. I spoke up because fundamentally broken systems physically bothered me. They felt like a splinter in my mind. Luckily, during those grueling, high-pressure first few years, my direct supervisor was a woman named Marianne Bell. Marianne was an exceedingly rare breed in the cutthroat, heavily male-dominated world of corporate disaster recovery. She was a leader who actually believed in elevating highly competent people, rather than standing heavily on their shoulders to make herself look taller to the executives. She was tough as old leather, chain-drank bitter green tea from a chipped ceramic mug, and possessed a mind like a steel bear trap. Whenever I successfully untangled a particularly nasty logistical knot, Marianne made absolutely certain my name was spelled correctly and printed in bold font on the after-action report sent to the regional directors. More importantly, Marianne taught me the fundamental rule of corporate survival that I would eventually use to save my own life. I vividly remember sitting in her cluttered office late one Friday evening after I had spent 10 straight hours rewriting a deeply flawed, highly inefficient dispatch protocol for the Panhandle region. She looked over my hand-drawn flowchart, nodded in silent approval, and then slid the paper back across the desk toward me. "It is brilliant work, Harper," she said, her voice gravelly from a long week of shouting on the phone. "But you need to remember this one thing. In this industry, it is never enough to just build a good, working system. The person who builds the system must learn to leave a permanent, traceable trail of exactly how it was made. Document your logic, timestamp every single draft, save your raw data. Because the day will inevitably come when someone who does not know how to build anything at all will walk into the room and try to claim they built yours." At the time, I thought she was just being overly cynical, damaged by too many years in the corporate trenches. I had no idea she was handing me the exact blueprint for my future defense. The true trial-by-fire test of my naive meritocracy came during a freak, brutal winter freeze that completely paralyzed the entire American South. Temperatures plummeted, power grids failed, and water pipes were bursting in walls from Texas to Georgia. Halcyon's expensive, highly touted automated dispatch software completely buckled and crashed under the unprecedented, staggering volume of emergency calls flooding into the call center. Absolute panic was setting in on the executive floor above us as clients screamed for help that was not arriving. Instead of sitting at my desk waiting for the IT department to fix a software system that was fundamentally broken at its core, I decided to bypass the digital world entirely. I stayed in the office for 3 straight days, sleeping in short bursts under my desk. I commandeered a massive, rolling whiteboard from a conference room and built a complex manual dispatch matrix from scratch, using dry erase markers and hundreds of sticky notes. I painstakingly cross-referenced the real-time phoned-in GPS coordinates of our remaining supply trucks with the most urgent incoming residential calls and the specific, verified skill sets of the nearest available field crews. By completely ignoring the broken software and trusting my manual, highly visual routing system, I managed to cut the waiting time for emergency supplies and initial inspections by nearly 20% across our 3 most critical sectors. The field foremen, rough, hardened men who usually despised the corporate office and viewed us as useless paper pushers, started bypassing the official, jammed dispatch hotline entirely. They began calling my direct desk extension at all hours of the day and night because they knew I would not give them empty corporate double talk. I would give them the exact, verified location of the heavy-duty drywall, the commercial dehumidifiers, and the licensed plumbers they desperately needed. That exhausting, freezing winter solidified my reputation among the people who actually did the dirty, dangerous work in the field. Tragically, it also solidified my own internal, deeply flawed illusion about the company. I looked at the highly successful performance metrics I had generated, the hard-earned respect from the gruff field crews, and the glowing, top-tier performance review. Marianne handed me that spring, and I made a fatal miscalculation. I truly believed that my career path, while undoubtedly demanding and often exhausting, was going to be a straight, upward line. I believed with all my heart that Halcyon Field Services was a true, honest meritocracy. I thought that as long as I continued to sharpen my analytical skills, as long as I remained smarter, faster, and more efficient than I was the day before, my position was permanently secure, and my value to the executives was fully recognized. I felt incredibly, dangerously safe. That fragile, comforting sense of safety evaporated into thin air the very moment Marianne Bell called an impromptu department meeting and announced her early retirement. She packed up her cluttered office into 3 cardboard boxes, gave me a final, knowing hug that felt entirely too tight, and walked out the heavy glass doors for the last time. Her departure left behind a massive, echoing power vacuum in the very heart of the operations department. The timing could not possibly have been worse for me. The company was aggressively restructuring, desperately eager to present a sleeker, younger, and more financially aggressive face to the Wall Street shareholders. To fill Marianne's suddenly empty chair, upper management bypassed all the hard-working internal candidates entirely. They looked outside the company and brought in a man who looked phenomenal on a glossy promotional brochure. They brought in an executive who spoke the complex, empty language of corporate synergy with flawless, highly practiced ease. He appeared entirely professional, perfectly tailored, and incredibly confident. But beneath that polished, expensive surface, he secretly possessed only one true, definable skill in the business world. He knew exactly how to find the brightest, most hardworking light in the room, stand directly in front of it, and effortlessly steal the glow for himself. Trent Lasker arrived on the executive floor wearing a bespoke, midnight blue suit that likely cost more than the annual rent for my first apartment. He was 46 years old and had been recruited directly from a notoriously aggressive private equity service firm in Chicago. The corporate communications email announcing his arrival had branded him as a restructuring star, a visionary brought in to streamline our regional operations. He possessed a deep, resonant baritone voice and a flawless, gleaming smile. He could stand in front of a room full of anxious, seasoned vice presidents and say absolutely nothing of concrete substance, yet string together empty corporate buzzwords with such rhythmic confidence that the entire room would collectively exhale. Feeling completely secure after hearing him speak for just 3 minutes. At first, I observed him from the safety of my cubicle and simply wrote him off as an empty suit. I assumed he was a purely cosmetic hire, a man who existed only to look good on the cover of the annual shareholder report, while the rest of us kept the actual machinery of the company running. But within his first 2 months, I realized I had severely underestimated him. Trent lacked the capacity to generate original operational strategies, but he possessed a highly refined, incredibly dangerous talent. He knew exactly how to identify the brightest ideas in the room, strip away the names of the people who created them, rebrand them as collective team initiatives, and then, a mere half-step later, present them to the upper echelon as his own brilliant, solitary breakthroughs. The first theft did not look like a heist. It looked like a routine administrative review. We were moving into the active storm season, and I had spent 3 weeks consulting with our veteran foreman to draft a comprehensive, highly specific safety checklist for field crews handling live electrical wires in flooded residential basements. It was granular, technical work designed to keep our contractors from getting electrocuted. I handed a printed copy to Trent on a Tuesday morning for his signature. 4 days later, at the quarterly regional safety summit, I sat in the back row of the auditorium. The lights dimmed, and a massive projector illuminated the screen behind the podium. I watched, a cold knot forming in my stomach, as my exact logic, my carefully structured sequencing, and my precise technical warnings were displayed on the screen. The only difference was that the document had been wrapped in a glossy new graphic design and boldly titled as the Lasker Hazard Mitigation Protocol. Trent stood on the stage, gripping the edges of the podium, and spoke passionately about the late nights he had spent analyzing field data to develop this new standard. He masterfully used the word "we" during the introduction, making it sound as though the entire department had brainstormed the concept under his benevolent guidance. But by the time he reached his concluding remarks, that inclusive "we" had seamlessly, effortlessly morphed into an authoritative "I." I sat perfectly still in the dark, my hands folded tightly in my lap, feeling the first sharp, undeniable crack in my professional foundation. A month later, the pattern escalated from simple plagiarism to active, deliberate exclusion. We were drowning in a massive logistical backlog in the coastal sector, following a sudden string of tropical depressions. I walked into Trent's glass office and mapped out exactly why we were failing. I explained that the initial inspection teams, the heavy demolition crews, and the municipal permitting department were operating entirely out of sync. I drew the bottleneck out on his expensive whiteboard, showing him the exact mathematical proof that a simple shift in our dispatch sequencing could save us thousands of wasted man-hours and hundreds of thousands of dollars in delayed penalty fees. Trent leaned back in his leather chair, steepled his manicured fingers together, and smiled warmly. "That is incredibly strategic thinking, Harper," he said, using the exact, patronizing tone one might use to praise a clever child who had just solved a simple puzzle. "I love the initiative. We are going to tackle this together." The very next morning, the regional vice president flew in from Atlanta for a critical operational review. I gathered my raw data reports and walked toward the main conference room. Just as I reached the threshold, Trent stepped into the doorway, physically blocking my path. He placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, gently but firmly pushing me back into the hallway. "I have got this one handled, Harper," he murmured, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial whisper, though his eyes were completely devoid of warmth. "We need to keep the room small for the big picture. You keep holding down the fort out here." The heavy oak door clicked shut, locking me out of the very conversation I had authored. I stood in the hallway, clutching my folders, realizing that he was actively building a wall between me and the people who actually controlled career advancement at Halcyon. He began constructing a tight, impenetrable inner circle. He actively promoted and rewarded men and women who possessed the singular, defining skill of nodding vigorously before he even finished his sentences. The sycophants thrived. Meanwhile, the people who actually understood the logistics, the ones who stayed at their desks until 9 o'clock at night untangling the messes the field crews encountered, were deliberately kept marginalized. We were kept entirely out of the high-level strategic discussions where promotions and bonuses were decided. We were treated as the grimy engine room of a luxury cruise ship. Trent was the handsome captain standing on the upper deck, happily taking the bows and accepting the applause from the passengers. But vanity and a fragile ego are standard, almost expected corporate sins. It was something else entirely that triggered the deepest, most primal alarm bells in my mind. As I continued to process the daily field data and reconcile the invoices, I started noticing a jarring, structural inconsistency that went far beyond stolen credit. Halcyon managed a roster of over 300 independent subcontractors. My analytical models clearly demonstrated which crews were efficient and which ones were bleeding our profit margins dry. Yet, a specific, concentrated handful of third-party vendors continued to receive our most lucrative, high-margin recovery contracts. It made absolutely no logistical sense. My spreadsheets showed these specific crews consistently lagging 3 to 5 days behind schedule. They were racking up inexplicable, massive overtime hours and generating severe cost overruns on simple jobs. Logically, Based on the pure math of their performance, they should have been suspended from our active dispatch roster immediately. Instead, their contracts were quietly renewed, approved, and even expanded by Trent's office. I did not storm into his office and demand an explanation. I did not run to the Human Resources Department to officially complain about intellectual property theft or questionable vendor assignments. I knew exactly how that scenario would play out. I was a young, introverted female operations analyst. He was the charismatic, highly compensated star executive brought in to save the region. The corporate ecosystem was explicitly, purposefully designed to protect men like him, not women like me. Any complaint I made would be immediately weaponized against me, labeled as a communication breakdown or framed as the emotional outburst of an employee who was simply not a team player. Instead, the blood in my veins went completely cold, and my mind became sharper and clearer than it had ever been in my entire life. I stopped operating like a trusting subordinate and started behaving like a forensic auditor operating behind enemy lines. My entire workflow shifted overnight. I completely stopped having casual, verbal brainstorming sessions in the hallways. Every single idea I generated, every minor workflow adjustment I proposed, and every operational observation I made was first typed out in full and emailed to my own personal, encrypted email address. This established an irrefutable third-party timestamp proving exactly when the idea was born and who authored it. When I worked on a new document or a complex spreadsheet on the company servers, I meticulously saved every single draft under a rigid version control system. I saved version 1, version 2, version 3, building a digital footprint so incredibly deep and dense that it could survive the most rigorous corporate scrutiny. Whenever Trent pulled me into his office for what he casually called a quick alignment chat, I would listen quietly, nod politely, and then walk straight back to my desk. Before I did anything else, I would type out a verbatim summary of the conversation, detailing his exact instructions and my exact responses, and email that record to my private server. I was not plotting a fiery, dramatic revenge at that point. I was not even truly angry yet. The anger would come later. At 25 years old, I was simply doing what any rational, highly observant person does when their basic survival instincts tell them they are standing next to a predator. I was quietly, methodically building a suit of armor. I realized that the man sitting in the corner office was not just a lazy manager who liked to take credit for my late nights. He was a parasite who would gladly consume my entire professional future without losing a single second of sleep. And if I continued to operate with blind faith, assuming that good work would eventually be rewarded by a broken system, I was going to be completely erased. The hurricane season that autumn was a relentless, punishing beast that threatened to break the entire company in half. We were hit with 3 major, catastrophic storms in a tightly compressed span of just 45 days. The entire Gulf Coast was transformed into a sprawling, chaotic disaster zone, and our central dispatch floor in Houston felt exactly like the engine room of a rapidly sinking ship. Management reacted the only way they knew how. They threw more warm bodies and more money at the problem, aggressively hiring expensive temporary field contractors at triple the standard hourly rate. But sitting at my desk, watching the chaotic, messy deployment data stream continuously across my 4 glowing monitors, I realized our core failure had absolutely nothing to do with a shortage of manpower. We were simply bleeding our profit margins dry through a system of catastrophic, fundamental misallocation. I watched in silent horror as our outdated dispatch software sent elite, highly paid structural engineers out to assess simple, low-level water damage. Meanwhile, basic debris removal crews sat entirely idle in their trucks for 48 hours, bleeding hourly wages, simply because they were waiting for routine municipal clearances that had been filed in the wrong county office. Large flatbed trucks carrying heavy industrial dehumidifiers were literally crossing paths on the same interstate highway, driving hundreds of miles in completely opposite directions because our routing logic was entirely blind to geographic reality. It was an incredibly expensive, agonizing failure of basic operational coordination, and it was costing the company hundreds of thousands of dollars every single week. I decided to build a permanent, unassailable solution. I conceptualized and began coding a system I named the Atlas Response Matrix. It was not going to be another static, useless spreadsheet that upper management could easily ignore or deliberately misinterpret. It was designed from the ground up to be a dynamic, multi-layered logistical engine. Atlas was built to simultaneously synthesize the exact severity of localized property damage, the precise GPS coordinates of our regional supply warehouses, the highly specific technical certifications of every single active field crew, the wildly varying processing speeds of local county permit offices, the ambient humidity levels that rapidly accelerated toxic mold growth, and real-time highway drive times. If a commercial roof collapsed in a specific coastal zip code, Atlas would not just alert a manager, it would instantly flag the nearest available crew with the correct legally required safety credentials. It would simultaneously verify the specific local permit requirements for that county, and it would automatically route the necessary heavy lumber and tarps from a warehouse that actually had the inventory in stock, calculating the most fuel-efficient route. It was designed to do all of this in one seamless, automated motion, entirely removing human error and favoritism from the equation. I knew immediately that I could not build something this massive and complex alone, and I absolutely could not let Trent Lasker catch even a faint whiff of its existence while the architecture was still vulnerable. I needed raw, unfiltered data from the very corners of the company that he actively ignored. I quietly, carefully recruited a shadow team of highly competent, deeply frustrated professionals. After the executive floor completely emptied out at 6 o'clock in the evening, I would walk down to the basement levels to meet with Owen Bellamy. Owen was a brilliantly cynical database architect from the systems department who possessed a deep, abiding hatred for corporate red tape and middle management. I also brought in Lila Brooks, a hardened, no-nonsense field supervisor who spent her days in steel-toed boots and knew exactly how the subcontractors manipulated their daily labor logs to steal overtime pay. Finally, I approached Ruth Calder, a sharply intelligent senior analyst in regional finance who harbored a hawk-like obsession with tracking wasted expense accounts and fraudulent vendor invoices. We operated like an underground resistance movement inside our own company. We worked in empty, unlit conference rooms at the end of deserted hallways. We spoke in hushed tones, surrounded by empty coffee cups and glowing laptop screens. Owen secretly provided me with the hidden, back-end server access I needed to pull the historical data. Lila gave me the brutal, unvarnished ground truth of what actually happened on the work sites, completely stripping away the sanitized lies the vendors told. Ruth fed me the terrifying, highly confidential cost data that proved exactly how much money the current system was hemorrhaging. Each of them contributed an absolutely essential layer of data to the matrix, and we were weaving a massive safety net entirely in the dark. To ensure the project remained completely off the official corporate ledger, where Trent could theoretically claim jurisdiction over it, I took out my own personal credit card. I purchased a highly advanced, commercial-grade geofencing software plugin out of my own pocket for $850. I securely integrated it into my private, heavily encrypted server environment. I spent my weekends and late nights running intense, heavy simulations using the massive datasets from the previous year's storms. I watched the digital models fail, meticulously tweaked the underlying algorithms, and ran them again and again until the chaotic routing paths finally smoothed out into perfect, elegant lines of maximum efficiency. When a sudden, late-season storm system severely flooded the suburban neighborhoods just outside of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, my shadow team and I quietly launched a blind pilot program. I bypassed the main, heavily monitored dispatch software entirely. I took the optimized Atlas routing protocols and fed them directly to a select group of trusted, overwhelmed regional dispatchers. The results were immediate, undeniable, and utterly staggering. Within 14 days of implementation, our average case processing time in that specific Louisiana sector dropped by a massive 40%. The amount of completely unnecessary, unapproved overtime hours billed by our notoriously slow subcontractors plummeted to almost zero. Most tellingly, the angry, desperate phone calls from frustrated homeowners waiting for emergency tarps almost entirely vanished from the call center logs. The veteran field foremen, rough men who routinely mocked any new initiative coming out of the Houston corporate office, had absolutely no idea who or what was behind the sudden, miraculous change. They only knew that for the first time in their careers, their weekly schedules were suddenly logical. They noticed that their trucks actually had the right materials upon arrival at a flooded house, and that the suffocating daily chaos of their jobs had miraculously lifted. To earn the silent, grudging approval of people who despise corporate flashiness and only care about results is the highest compliment an operations analyst can ever receive. It proved that Atlas was not just a good idea, it was a revolutionary weapon. My strategic plan was clear, absolute, and highly guarded. I was going to wait patiently until the Atlas system was completely bulletproof. I needed the data to be so overwhelmingly undeniable that no executive sitting in a leather chair could possibly ignore it. Then, I planned to aggressively bypass my direct managerial chain entirely. I would request a formal recorded presentation directly with the senior leadership team. I would walk into that boardroom flanked by Owen, Lila, and Ruth. I would bring irrefutable, cryptographically secured proof of my authorship, the raw, unfiltered data from the Louisiana pilot program, and strong, vocal validators from 3 entirely separate departments. It would be a fortress of competence that Trent Lasker could not possibly breach or claim as his own, but a predator always senses a subtle shift in the ecosystem, even if he does not understand the science behind it. As I moved closer to the final, polished stages of the matrix, Trent began to hover around my workspace. He noticed the sudden, dramatic improvement in the Louisiana operational metrics, though he had done absolutely nothing to cause them. He noticed that I was no longer coming into his glass office bringing him minor logistical problems to solve. He started dropping by my desk unannounced, his eyes darting quickly across my minimized computer screens before I could lock them. "You have been awfully quiet lately, Harper," he said one afternoon, leaning casually against the wall of my cubicle, his tone dripping with a false, manufactured warmth. "Just making sure you are not hiding any brilliant little pet projects from your team leader." He smiled when he said it, but his eyes were entirely cold and searching. He could smell that I was holding something incredibly valuable, something that had the power to change the entire operational structure of the region. And I knew, with absolute, chilling certainty, that he was already calculating his next move. He was preparing to force me to surrender it to him, or he was going to find a way to swallow the entire achievement whole before I ever had the chance to open my mouth. The quiet phase of my work was officially over. The hunt had begun. The trap was set with the kind of casual, predatory grace that had become his signature. Trent leaned against the frame of my cubicle late on a Thursday afternoon, holding a ceramic mug of green tea. He did not ask what I was working on. He already knew I was holding something massive. "I have been hearing some very interesting whispers from the dispatch floor. Harper," he said, his voice dropping into that smooth, conspiratorial register. "They are saying you have built some sort of magic bullet for our routing issues. I want to see it. Send me an executive preview of this little project. Let me look under the hood and help you polish the presentation so it actually speaks the language of the board of directors. We do not want them getting lost in the technical weeds." He framed it as a mentorship opportunity, a benevolent boss reaching down to pull his subordinate up the ladder, but I knew exactly what a preview meant in his vocabulary. It meant handing over the keys to the kingdom. I smiled politely, nodded, and agreed to send the files before the end of the day, but I did not send him the actual matrix. I spent the next 2 hours meticulously stripping the engine out of the car. I created a heavily sanitized, visually impressive, but functionally hollow sandbox version of the system. It had the beautiful color-coded dashboards and the sleek interface, but I severed all ties to the deep, real-time data feeds and the predictive algorithms. I kept the absolute core of the architecture locked away on my private server. My caution was validated exactly 3 days later. At 9:15 in the evening, my cell phone vibrated on my kitchen counter. It was a secure message from Owen Bellamy down in the systems department. "Your boss just tried to bypass the security protocols," Owen wrote. He physically walked down to my desk after hours and demanded emergency administrative override access to your testing directory. He claimed you were offline and he needed to pull a critical demonstration report for the vice presidents. Trent had completely bypassed me to rip the raw data straight from the servers. He was preparing to unveil my system at a high-level strategy meeting scheduled for the following Tuesday. I opened the corporate calendar on my laptop and searched for the meeting invite. Just as I expected, my name was entirely absent from the guest list. He was going to stand in a room full of regional directors and present the culmination of my life's work as his own solitary stroke of genius. I immediately logged into the shadow server network Owen had built for me to see exactly what Trent had exported. I expected to find a simple case of intellectual property theft. I expected to see my name erased from the title slides. What I found instead was infinitely more sinister. When I opened the cloned file of Trent's exported demonstration, my blood ran completely cold. He had not just stolen the system, he had surgically mutilated it. The entire purpose of the Atlas Matrix was to act as an unblinking, mathematically pure eye. It was designed to automatically flag logistical anomalies, cost overruns, and vendor inefficiencies in bright, unmistakable red warnings. But in the specific version Trent had exported for the executives, an entire category of those critical warning flags had been manually, deliberately turned off. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I traced the disabled code back to its source. It was not a blanket suppression. It was a highly targeted, specific filter. He had muted every single performance failure alert and cost overrun warning tied to exactly one subcontractor, a mid-sized outfit named Blackridge Remediation. I pulled up the raw, unfiltered historical data for Blackridge. The numbers were staggering. According to the unedited metrics, they were a complete operational disaster. Their job completion times were consistently 40% slower than the regional average. Their error rates on basic moisture extraction and structural drying were astronomically high, often requiring us to send a second team to fix their mistakes. Logically, a vendor with this profile should have been permanently blacklisted from our dispatch roster months ago. Yet, when I cross-referenced their terrible performance metrics with the active dispatch logs, I found a massive, glaring contradiction. Blackridge was continually being force-fed the thickest, most lucrative commercial recovery contracts in the entire Gulf Coast sector. I needed a forensic microscope to understand the depth of the rot. I immediately called Ruth Calder. Within 48 hours, Ruth handed me a thick stack of audited, heavily highlighted payment histories that made my stomach physically turn. Blackridge was not just incompetent, they were systematically and aggressively bleeding the company dry, and Trent was actively facilitating it. "Look at the billing dates," Ruth whispered, as we stood in the farthest corner of the underground parking garage. "They are submitting duplicate equipment surcharges across 3 entirely different zip codes on the exact same afternoon. They are charging us daily rental fees for heavy-duty industrial generators that are supposedly running simultaneously at job sites located 200 miles apart. It is physically impossible." She pointed to another column of highlighted numbers. "They are artificially inflating their travel mileage on every single invoice, turning simple 30-mile suburban trips into massive, cross-state logistical endeavors to claim maximum fuel reimbursement. And someone with executive authority is blind approving every single one of these invoices without requiring the standard photographic proof of deployment." That someone was Trent Lasker. The financial fraud was massive, but I needed to know the physical reality on the ground. I sent a secure message to Lila Brooks, who was currently overseeing a commercial sector out east. "Get your eyes on a Blackridge crew tomorrow morning," I wrote. "Do not let them see you. Just observe and document." The very next afternoon, a dozen high-resolution photographs arrived in my encrypted inbox. Lila had parked her truck 2 blocks away from a flooded commercial strip mall that Blackridge was contracted to mitigate. The pictures she sent were a corporate liability nightmare. The images clearly showed Blackridge personnel tearing out black, soaked, actively molding drywall without wearing the legally mandated respiratory gear or hazardous material suits. But the most terrifying photograph was the last one. While the crew was on a lunch break, Lila had slipped into the site manager's trailer and photographed their daily credential binder. They are running heavy extraction machinery without the legally required state certifications, Lila wrote in the attached message. Half these guys are day laborers pulled off the street this morning. If a single commercial property owner develops respiratory issues and files a lawsuit, the discovery phase will instantly reveal that Halcyon knowingly deployed unlicensed, uncertified contractors into a hazardous environment. The legal liability was catastrophic. A single massive lawsuit of that nature would not just hurt the company, it possessed the power to completely bankrupt the entire regional division. I sat back in my chair, staring at the monitors, as the final, terrifying puzzle pieces violently snapped together. The Atlas Matrix was never just a brilliant operational scheduling tool. Without realizing it, I had built a massive, uncompromising floodlight and shined it directly into the darkest corner of the company. By mapping out the absolute, undeniable mathematical truth of our logistical efficiency, I had accidentally illuminated a massive, orchestrated ring of contractor favoritism and financial fraud. Trent Lasker was not just hiding his own incompetence by stealing my ideas. He was actively steering hundreds of thousands of dollars to a corrupt vendor, and he was using his executive authority to deliberately blind the company's financial oversight mechanisms. When he saw my system, he did not just see a way to secure a promotion. He saw a weapon that could instantly expose his entire grift. He had to demand access to it. He had to control the narrative. He needed my system to build a flawless digital cover story, presenting heavily manipulated data to the board to prove his vendors were succeeding. The stakes of the game instantly changed. This was no longer a mundane, frustrating corporate dispute over a stolen safety checklist. I was no longer fighting a lazy, narcissistic manager who simply wanted to take credit for my late nights. I was staring down a man who was actively corrupting the financial and legal integrity of an entire corporation to feed his own pockets. Even worse, by demanding access to my system and attaching his name to the manipulated data. He was quietly positioning me to take the absolute, catastrophic fall when the entire fraudulent architecture inevitably collapsed. If the auditors ever caught the missing money, Trent would simply point to my complex algorithms and blame a system failure. I was entirely alone in the crosshairs of a massive corporate crime. But as I locked my computer screen and packed my tote bag that evening, I did not feel fear. I felt a cold, absolute, and total clarity. Trent Lasker believed he was playing a brilliant game of chess against a naive subordinate. He had no idea I had already mapped the entire board, and I was holding all the pieces. I ceased operating under the mindset of an oppressed employee the very moment I understood the full architecture of his deception. Panic is a useless emotion, and righteous anger is a profound waste of kinetic energy. I am an operations analyst. My entire professional existence is defined by my ability to look at a chaotic, failing structure and methodically map out its exact points of vulnerability. Trent Lasker believed he had backed me into a dark corner, where my only options were silent submission or an unhinged, emotional outburst that would instantly discredit me. He was profoundly mistaken. I was not trapped. I was simply taking inventory of my ammunition. I began treating my daily corporate life as an active crime scene. I established a rigorous, uncompromising chain of custody for every single piece of data that flowed through my department. I created a hidden, encrypted master ledger on a completely isolated solid-state drive. I did not write in it like a diary. I stripped away all adjectives, all personal grievances, and all emotional interpretations. I wrote every entry with the cold, sterile precision of a forensic auditor. My ledger recorded exactly what event occurred, the precise time it happened, the specific individual who authorized the change, and the mathematically measurable consequence of that action. If a routing protocol was altered to favor our problematic vendor, I documented the original logic, the altered command, and the resulting financial loss down to the exact cent. I built a timeline so structurally sound that it could easily withstand the brutal scrutiny of a federal subpoena. My shadow team moved from gathering intelligence to actively securing the perimeter. Owen Bellamy isolated the primary server logs down in the basement. He quietly partitioned a secure digital vault containing the complete, unaltered edit history of the routing matrix. His logs proved, with indisputable cryptographic certainty, that I had authored the foundational code, built the architecture, and run the successful beta tests a full 6 months before Trent Lasker ever requested his deceptive executive preview. Simultaneously, Ruth Calder began intercepting the raw financial exports at 2 o'clock every single morning. She captured the massive, bloated cost overruns generated by the corrupt contractor before Trent and his loyalists arrived at 9 o'clock to manually scrub the daily reports clean. Ruth provided the unvarnished mathematical truth, preserving the exact numbers that proved the company was bleeding capital. But to build an airtight case, mathematical discrepancies were not enough. I needed to document the motive. Incompetence can be easily dismissed by corporate executives as a simple lack of oversight, but deliberate, coordinated fraud requires a deeply rooted connection. I found that connection through Naomi Sloan, a senior specialist in the internal compliance department. Naomi was a remarkably quiet, highly observant woman who spent her days reviewing the mandatory conflict of interest disclosures filed by regional management. She had noticed the glaring irregularities long before I did, but she had been terrified to speak up in a culture that consistently punished whistleblowers. Over a series of highly encrypted, vanishing messages sent well after midnight, Naomi handed me the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. She confirmed that the primary owner of the fraudulent remediation company was not just a random external contractor. He was the brother-in-law of Trent Lasker's closest, longest-standing college fraternity brother. It was a direct, undeniable personal link that had been intentionally and illegally omitted from every single internal vendor onboarding document and annual compliance declaration Trent had ever signed. Naomi securely transmitted the archived, falsified disclosure forms to my encrypted drive. I now possessed the exact mechanism of his fraud, the stolen funds, and the deliberate perjury used to conceal it. With the evidence quietly mounting in the dark, my most difficult daily task was maintaining the illusion of total defeat in the daylight. I had to actively manage Trent's perception of my psychological state. If he sensed even a fraction of my true confidence, he would immediately accelerate his timeline and purge me from the department before my trap could snap shut. So, I deliberately played the part he expected me to play. I arrived at the office every morning precisely at 8:45. I kept my head down. I kept my voice soft and deferential during the morning stand-up meetings. I maintained a polite, slightly withdrawn demeanor, projecting the exact image of a talented but ultimately submissive woman who had finally accepted her designated place in the corporate hierarchy. I let him believe that I was simply too tired, too intimidated, and too invested in my bi-weekly paycheck to ever launch a meaningful counterattack. He looked at me and saw a neutralized threat. He had no idea he was looking at a demolition expert wiring the foundation of his career with high explosives. His absolute arrogance eventually bred a profound, reckless laziness. As the end of the third fiscal quarter approached, Trent grew incredibly bold. He called me into his spacious glass office to review the quarterly departmental performance metrics. The printed spreadsheet he laid proudly on his mahogany desk was an absolute masterpiece of corporate fiction. The project completion rates had been artificially inflated by a staggering 40%. The massive budget deficits caused by his favored contractor had been skillfully buried under vaguely defined, unaudited administrative overhead categories. He slid the fabricated document across the polished wood, placed an expensive silver pen on top of it, and casually asked for my signature on the bottom line. He wanted me to sign off as the lead operational analyst, effectively verifying that his beautiful, entirely fraudulent numbers were mathematically sound. It was his ultimate insurance policy. If the internal auditors ever caught the discrepancies, my signature would ensure that I went down as the incompetent analyst who failed to catch the errors, leaving his hands completely clean. I did not refuse him outright. A direct refusal would have triggered his defensive instincts immediately. Instead, I picked up the document, scanned the columns with a look of mild, professional confusion, and smiled warmly. "These metrics look absolutely incredible. Trent," I said, my voice completely smooth and devoid of sarcasm, "you have really turned the regional numbers around this quarter. I am more than happy to sign off on the final packet. I just need you to forward me the raw, unedited database query logs so I can quickly reconcile the source data against the regional invoices. It is just a standard, mandatory compliance step on my end before I can legally attach my name to a finalized federal reporting document. Send those over, and I will sign this immediately." I watched the muscles in his jaw tighten instantly. A flicker of cold panic flashed behind his eyes. He knew exactly what I was asking for. He knew the raw source data would instantly expose the massive numerical manipulation. He could not provide the query logs without handing me direct proof of the manipulation, and he could not force me to sign a blind document without violating 3 different corporate bylaws. "Do not worry about it, Harper," he said, quickly pulling the paper back across the desk and snatching the silver pen. His voice was tight, the false warmth entirely gone. "We are on a strict deadline with the vice presidents. I will just sign off on the executive override myself this time to save us the administrative hassle. You can just focus on your daily routing tasks." "Are you absolutely sure?" I asked, maintaining a look of innocent helpfulness. "I really do not mind doing the reconciliation." "I am sure," he snapped, scribbling his own name aggressively at the bottom of the page. I nodded, stood up, and walked out of his office. He had just voluntarily isolated his own signature on a heavily doctored financial document, completely shielding me from the legal fallout. Many people, when pushed to the absolute brink in a corporate environment, immediately rush to the human resources department. It is a fatal, emotionally driven mistake. Human resources does not exist to administer absolute justice. Their primary directive is to protect the corporation from external legal liability and bad public relations. If I had walked into their office with a fragmented story about stolen credit and suspicious contracts, they would have immediately classified the situation as a routine interpersonal conflict. They would have offered mandatory mediation sessions. Worst of all, they would have quietly tipped Trent off, giving him ample time to destroy the server logs, delete his emails, and systematically fire my shadow team. I was not interested in mediation, and I was certainly not interested in a quiet, confidential settlement. I was quietly constructing a dossier so dense, so terrifyingly complete, and so legally catastrophic that when I finally dropped it on the table, the executive board would have absolutely no choice but to sever him completely and immediately to save their own lucrative positions. I was no longer building a defensive wall to protect my job. I was meticulously building a stage. I had carefully positioned the lights, secured the unalterable script, and mapped out exactly where the audience would sit. I only needed to wait for the lead actor to step under the brightest spotlight, succumb to his own boundless greed, and make one final, undeniable mistake. And in the chaotic, high-stakes world of disaster recovery, I knew with absolute certainty that the next storm was always just over the horizon. Nature provided the ultimate stress test in late August. A monstrous Category 4 hurricane slammed into the Gulf Coast, completely devastating the coastal infrastructure from Galveston all the way to Pensacola. The emergency dispatch board on the 4th floor lit up like a localized blackout, flashing with thousands of priority requests every single hour. This was the exact catastrophe the Atlas system was designed to handle. I had the servers spun up and fully ready to automate the entire recovery logistics network. The Matrix was fully capable of deploying hundreds of certified teams in a matter of seconds, based on pure geographic and technical efficiency, eliminating all human bias. Instead of letting the system work and saving the company millions of dollars in wasted time, Trent Lasker panicked, or rather, he saw an unprecedented goldmine. He aggressively instituted a manual executive override on the dispatch floor. He commanded the exhausted dispatchers to bypass my algorithm entirely and forcefully funneled a massive, totally disproportionate volume of the highest-paying commercial recovery contracts directly to Blackridge remediation. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Within 14 days, everything I had mathematically predicted came true with devastating accuracy. Blackridge was hopelessly overwhelmed. They lacked the manpower, the heavy equipment, and the basic logistical competence to handle even a tenth of the contracts Trent had blindly gifted them. Critical recovery timelines stretched from a standard 48 hours to a staggering 3 weeks. Worse, Lila Brooks sent me frantic, highly confidential field reports detailing how Blackridge was sending completely untrained, uncertified day laborers into highly sensitive commercial medical facilities to handle toxic water extraction. Furious clients, including major commercial hospital administrators and national insurance adjusters, began threatening massive breach of contract lawsuits. The cost overruns were exploding into the millions of dollars, creating a financial crater so large and so obvious that Trent could no longer bury it under vaguely defined administrative categories. When the regional vice presidents finally demanded an explanation for the plunging profit margins and the skyrocketing client complaints, Trent did exactly what cornered predators do. He searched for a human shield. At 8 a.m. on a Tuesday, an email landed in my inbox, carbon copied to the entire regional leadership team. Trent had drafted a masterful piece of corporate fiction. He formally attributed the massive logistical failures and the delayed deployment times to a rogue, unauthorized experimental routing model that had allegedly corrupted the primary dispatch software. He explicitly named me as the sole architect of this failed experiment, claiming my unapproved technical tinkering had misaligned the operational flow and directly caused the entire season's chaos. He was officially building the paper trail to fire me for cause. 20 minutes after that email went out, he summoned me to the main glass-walled conference room. He did not sit across from me. He stood at the head of the heavy mahogany table, leaning forward to physically dominate the space. He tossed a thick, aggressively stapled document onto the polished wood. It was a formal performance improvement plan. In the corporate world, this is a death sentence, strategically issued exactly 4 weeks before the year-end bonus review. The document was filled with fabricated infractions, formally accusing me of gross insubordination, poor internal communication, and reckless data management. "You are a very smart girl, Harper," Trent said, his voice dripping with heavy, suffocating condescension. "But you have a fundamental flaw. People who spend all day staring at spreadsheets usually have absolutely no idea how corporate politics actually work. You built a toy, and it broke when we needed it most. You embarrassed this department, and you cost us a tremendous amount of money." I looked at the printed document, keeping my hands perfectly still at my sides, then looked up at him. The server data clearly shows that the severe delays were caused by manual overrides favoring a single vendor, Trent. Atlas was never officially activated on the main floor. He smiled, a cold, empty expression that did not reach his eyes. Data only matters when the people in charge decide it matters. Right now, the executives believe my version of events because I am the one who sits in the room with them. I control the narrative. If you sign this document today, accept the formal reprimand, and quietly do your job without questioning my vendor assignments ever again, I can keep your record clean. I can make sure you survive the post-storm layoffs. But if you try to fight me on this, I will personally make sure you never work in operations management in this state again. That specific, arrogant threat was the final catalyst I needed. Any lingering doubts I had about the morality of my course of action completely evaporated in the freezing air of that conference room. This was no longer just a defensive maneuver against a toxic manager stealing my ideas. I was staring at a man who fundamentally believed that his fabricated authority gave him the absolute right to crush a woman's career simply because she refused to quietly facilitate his corruption. He thought he could grind me down into submission with a single piece of paper. I picked up the heavy silver pen he had provided, but I did not sign the document. "I will need 24 hours to review these terms before I sign anything," I said evenly, maintaining absolute eye contact. Take all the time you need to come to your senses, he sneered, turning his back on me to look out the large window overlooking the highway. I walked out of the conference room and immediately set my exit strategy into motion. I had absolutely no intention of letting my departure be framed as the desperate retreat of a failed, incompetent employee. Over the past 3 weeks, I had been quietly interviewing with a rapidly expanding, highly innovative operational technology firm called Stonemere Risk Systems. They had reviewed my sanitized portfolio, tested my system architecture knowledge, and recognized exactly what I was capable of building without needing a man to translate it for them. That very afternoon, I formally accepted their offer for a senior director position, securing a 30% salary increase and a mandate to build a national logistics framework completely from scratch. With my financial future entirely secure, I took a personal day and drove across town to meet with a ruthless, highly regarded outside employment attorney. We sat in her quiet, leather-bound office for 5 straight hours. We meticulously reviewed every single piece of my chain of custody archive. We verified the isolated server logs Owen had preserved, the raw financial exports Ruth had captured, and the devastating conflict of interest disclosures Naomi had unearthed. My lawyer looked at the final stack of evidence, took off her reading glasses, and shook her head in sheer disbelief. "This is not just a standard wrongful termination or hostile workplace suit," she said quietly. "This is massive corporate fraud, severe breach of fiduciary duty, and gross negligence. If you hand this dossier to their audit committee, they will have to decapitate their own regional leadership just to survive the impending federal liability." We carefully selected the exact moment to strike. I wanted maximum visibility and zero chance for Trent to control the fallout behind closed doors. We chose the morning of his highly anticipated internal promotion hearing. He was scheduled to present his fabricated successes to the entire executive board, fully expecting to walk out of that room as a newly minted regional vice president. He firmly believed he had successfully intimidated me into silence. He thought the performance improvement plan had broken my spirit, locked my mouth shut, and permanently secured his cover story. He had absolutely no idea that while he was standing in his office rehearsing his confident victory speech, I was finalizing the binding legal documents that would systematically and publicly dismantle his entire professional existence before the lunch hour even began. By the time I returned to Trent's office that Thursday morning, every piece was already in place. I handed him my resignation and the charcoal folder, and for the first time, he understood that this was no bluff. The moment he realized where the evidence had already been sent, his confidence collapsed. I left him there to face the consequences, still unsure whether Halcyon's leadership would protect the truth or protect itself. I did not even make it to the ground floor before the tectonic plates of Halcyon Field Services began to violently shift. By the time I reached the underground parking garage and started my car, my phone was buzzing relentlessly with secure alerts from Owen. The initial shockwave had detonated precisely on schedule. At exactly 11 o'clock that morning, the executive boardroom doors remained firmly shut. Trent Lasker's highly anticipated promotion hearing was abruptly and indefinitely postponed. Within an hour of my departure, the corporate legal department issued a sweeping mandatory litigation hold on every single server log, email, and database query connected to the Atlas matrix. Simultaneously, the Regional Accounts Payable Office placed an immediate, hard freeze on all outgoing vendor disbursements to Black Ridge Remediation. The trap had finally been triggered, but the corporate machine was built to protect the people at the controls, and it immediately tried to contain the fallout. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Human Resources launched their standard, highly predictable containment protocol. They were not trying to find the truth. They were trying to neutralize the blast radius. My cell phone rang, displaying the number of the Senior Director of Human Resources. "Harper, we are reviewing the incredibly dense file you left behind," she said, her voice practically dripping with a manufactured, calming sweetness. "Let us just get into a private room, just the two of us, and sort out this unfortunate communication breakdown regarding your project contributions." I sat in my parked car and stared at the concrete wall of the garage. I will not participate in any unrecorded, informal chats, I replied, my voice completely devoid of warmth. Every single piece of evidence speaks for itself. All future communication from your office must be in writing, and you will copy my external legal counsel on every single line. I ended the call. My absolute refusal to play their soft corporate game forced the general counsel to instantly take the reins away from human resources. I had successfully elevated the situation from a manageable interpersonal complaint to a severe, uncontainable legal crisis. Back at the headquarters, the internal investigation team moved swiftly, sequestering Owen, Ruth, Naomi, and Lila. They pulled my shadow team into stark, windowless meeting rooms one by one. Corporate investigators are expertly trained to intimidate lower-level staff, to make them feel entirely isolated and vulnerable. Initially, the team was terrified, but when the investigators began laying out the printed logs and the heavily documented timelines I had provided, the fear completely evaporated. Owen saw that I had shielded his unauthorized server access by claiming full responsibility for the data pull. Ruth saw her financial exports perfectly aligned with the undeniable proof of contractor fraud. Seeing the absolute bulletproof integrity of the dossier I had built gave them the profound courage to stop whispering. They sat in those cold rooms and calmly, precisely corroborated every single allegation I had made. But Trent was a cornered apex predator, and he did not quietly accept his execution. He launched a vicious, highly calculated counteroffensive. He bypassed human resources entirely and went straight to the regional vice presidents. He utilized his most dangerous weapon, his silver tongue. He confidently argued that as the regional director of operations, any system developed within his department was automatically his intellectual property. She has absolutely no legal right to claim ownership of the matrix, Trent told the executives, spinning a terrifyingly plausible lie to save his own skin. She is a bitter, rogue analyst who intentionally misaligned the dispatch routing during the massive hurricane out of sheer spite. This entire folder is a fabricated smokescreen she desperately manufactured to cover her own tracks and avoid termination for her catastrophic logistical failures. It was a brilliant, desperate move that might have actually worked in a room full of men who desperately wanted to believe him. But the fragile architecture of his lie spectacularly collapsed from an entirely unexpected direction. Sienna Vale, a highly respected, deeply conservative senior vice president of finance, was officially interviewed by the internal auditors later that afternoon. Sienna was the executive who had blindly authorized the massive financial overrides during the storm. When the auditors showed her the original, unedited financial data, alongside the heavily manipulated summaries Trent had personally handed her, the color completely drained from her face. Sienna was not an accomplice. She was a victim of his deception, and she possessed far more institutional power than Trent ever would. "He handed me sanitized summaries," Sienna stated firmly to the audit committee, her voice shaking with genuine fury. "I authorized those financial exceptions based on deliberate, calculated misrepresentations of the vendor's performance." The moment Sienna Vale realized she had been utilized as a pawn to authorize fraudulent payments, Trent lost his absolute last shred of executive protection. The scandal was no longer a dispute between a toxic manager and an angry analyst. It was a senior executive officially admitting that the regional financial oversight protocols had been maliciously breached. Before the executives could even process Sienna's devastating admission, the internal bleeding suddenly turned outward. Halcyon's largest client, a massive national insurance conglomerate that accounted for over 40% of our regional revenue, caught wind of the internal chaos. Their lead adjuster sent a terrifying, legally binding notice directly to our board of directors. They officially threatened to audit their entire multi-million-dollar contract and suspend all future assignments if they discovered that Halcyon was intentionally covering up unlicensed contractor violations on their commercial properties. What started as an internal operations dispute instantly metastasized into an existential threat to the company's entire bottom line. Faced with absolute, unavoidable ruin, Trent made his final, most desperate mistake. He utilized his few remaining loyalists to strategically leak a vicious rumor to the executive floor. "She is stealing proprietary client information to sell to our competitors," his allies whispered in the hallways, claiming I had maliciously downloaded terabytes of highly classified data to a personal server before resigning. It was a blatant attempt to frame me for corporate espionage, hoping to force the company to fire me and instantly discredit my entire dossier in one sweeping motion. The move spectacularly backfired. My attorney was waiting for exactly this kind of amateur retaliation. Within 20 minutes of the rumor surfacing, she filed a formal injunction and submitted the complete, cryptographically sealed metadata logs of my digital archive directly to the company's general counsel. The logs unequivocally proved that I had only preserved the exact operational spreadsheets and emails directly related to the fraudulent Blackridge accounts. I had not touched a single piece of proprietary client data. Furthermore, my lawyer explicitly reminded the corporate legal team that penalizing a whistleblower who was actively preserving evidence of financial fraud would result in a massive, highly public federal lawsuit that they could not possibly win. The walls completely closed in. The human resources containment strategy had totally failed. Trent's aggressive counter-narrative had been entirely dismantled by his own falsified documents and a furious financial executive. The looming threat of a massive external client defection made it completely impossible to sweep the issue under the rug. By late Friday afternoon, the general counsel formally bypassed the standard disciplinary hierarchy. They issued a mandatory summons for a special, high-level executive review session scheduled for the following Monday morning. It was not going to be a soft mediation. It was not going to be a quiet internal investigation. It was an executive tribunal. Everything had burned right up to the rafters, and the corporate power structure was finally forced to look directly at the flames. The special executive review session convened at exactly 9 o'clock on Monday morning. The venue was the grand boardroom on the top floor, a cavernous space paneled in dark cherry wood with a massive, boat-shaped table that usually hosted international mergers, not internal discipline. The room was packed with the highest concentration of corporate power in the entire southern region. The general counsel sat at the head of the table, flanked by 3 senior forensic auditors. Sienna Vale, the senior vice president of finance, sat rigidly to the left, her expression carved from absolute stone. Trent Lasker walked through the heavy double doors at 2 minutes past 9. He was wearing his signature midnight blue suit, his hair flawlessly styled. He strode in with his chin held high, attempting to project the relaxed, slightly annoyed aura of a busy executive who was humoring a minor administrative misunderstanding. He genuinely believed his own silver tongue could still magically navigate him out of the crisis, just as it had countless times before. But I was already seated at the table, and I did not look like an underperforming employee begging for her job. I sat perfectly straight, my hands folded calmly over the charcoal folder. I was no longer the quiet analyst he could casually dismiss. I was the recognized architect of the Atlas response matrix, and the central, immovable witness to his entire criminal enterprise. The general counsel did not offer pleasantries. He immediately yielded the floor to my shadow team. Owen Bellamy stood up first, connecting his secure laptop to the massive digital projector at the front of the room. He bypassed the sanitized slideshow Trent had prepared for his promotion and brought up the raw, unfiltered source code of the matrix. With a few keystrokes, Owen projected the exact moment in the server logs when Trent had manually disabled the internal warning flags. In stark, glowing colors, the entire room watched the catastrophic results of that single command. They saw the elegant, automated dispatch routes violently twisted to forcefully feed impossible volumes of work to Blackridge remediation. The sheer, undeniable mathematical proof of the manipulation hung over the table, instantly suffocating Trent's narrative that the system was merely a broken toy. Ruth Calder stepped forward next, handing thick-bound financial ledgers to every executive at the table. She did not use corporate jargon. She used cold, hard currency. She walked them through the fabricated travel mileage and the duplicated equipment surcharges, pointing out exactly how the approved invoices bypassed standard auditing because Trent had utilized his executive override. She quantified the exact financial damage he had inflicted upon the company in the last 60 days alone, a number soaring well into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Naomi Sloan from compliance delivered the fatal blow to his character. She projected the falsified conflict of interest forms, placing them directly beside the legally verified business registration of Blackridge Remediation. The registration clearly listed Trent's college fraternity brother as the primary owner. A collective, audible gasp rippled through the legal team. This was the irrefutable proof of intent. It proved the mismanagement was not incompetence, but a highly orchestrated, deliberate siphoning of corporate funds to a personal associate. Finally, Lila Brooks stood up. She did not wear a suit. She wore her standard field boots and a high-visibility jacket. She brought the sterile numbers into the terrifying reality of the physical world. She placed her high-resolution photographs onto the polished wood, showing the uncertified, unprotected laborers tearing out toxic drywall on commercial job sites. She used the blunt, unvarnished language of a foreman, explicitly detailing the catastrophic legal liability the company now faced because Trent had bypassed safety protocols to feed his fraudulent vendor. Trent sat frozen in his expensive chair. His flawless posture had completely collapsed. His skin was pale and damp with cold sweat. He looked frantically around the room, trying to make eye contact with the vice presidents he used to golf with, but they all stared back at him with absolute, unconcealed disgust. The absolute killing strike, however, did not come from me or my team. It came from the lead forensic auditor, a quiet, meticulous man sitting near the general counsel. He looked up from the technical schematics of the Atlas system and adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Lasker," the auditor said, his voice echoing in the dead silence of the room. "In your written promotion packet, you claimed that the core predictive routing logic of this matrix was your own strategic initiative. Could you please explain to the committee exactly how the algorithm weights the variable of ambient humidity against the projected drive times of our heavy transport vehicles? It was a fundamental, highly specific question about the very engine of the machine. If Trent had actually built it, or even bothered to understand it before he stole it, he could have answered it in 10 seconds. Instead, Trent opened his mouth, and nothing of substance came out. He stammered. He threw out a desperate handful of empty corporate buzzwords, mentioning operational synergy and dynamic logistical flow. He talked in circles for 2 agonizing minutes, completely failing to address the mathematical equation. The entire room watched him drown. In that single, excruciating moment, every executive present finally understood the absolute truth. Trent Lasker had never created a single thing of value in his entire career. He was an empty vessel, a parasite who had finally attached himself to a host that was strong enough to completely destroy him. The general counsel raised his hand, cutting Trent off mid-sentence. The executive board's conclusion was swift, brutal, and unanimous. Trent Lasker was terminated for gross misconduct and severe breach of fiduciary duty, effective immediately. He was ordered to surrender his corporate credentials and his phone on the spot. Security was called to instantly escort him out of the building. His pending promotion was entirely vaporized, and the legal department formally announced they would begin the process of aggressively clawing back every single performance bonus he had received over the past 2 years. Furthermore, the contract with Blackridge Remediation was instantly frozen, and the entire file was handed over for a massive, external legal investigation. Trent did not look at me as the security guards placed their hands on his shoulders. He kept his eyes glued to the floor, a thoroughly broken man, and was marched out of the room in total silence. Once the door clicked shut behind him, the general counsel turned his attention to me. The atmosphere shifted from an execution back to a desperate negotiation. They knew I held all the cards, and they knew my external attorney was waiting for a single misstep. I was officially recognized as the sole creator and architect of the Atlas response matrix in writing. My fabricated performance review was completely expunged from the corporate records. To settle the matter and reduce the company's legal exposure, the board offered me a substantial severance package. It was equivalent to a massive executive retention bonus, easily equating to 2 full years of my salary. Sienna Vale leaned forward, offering me a highly lucrative, independent consulting contract to stay and officially implement the system nationwide. But I looked around the room at the executives who had happily enabled Trent until it threatened their own wallets, and I knew I could never work within these walls again. I accepted the financial package, signed the non-disclosure agreement protecting the company's public reputation, and politely declined their consulting offer. I was walking away, but this time, I was leaving strictly on my own uncompromising terms. An hour later, I stepped out through the heavy glass doors of the headquarters and onto the wet pavement of the plaza. The fierce afternoon rainstorm had finally broken, leaving the Houston air feeling strangely cool and completely clean. I held the charcoal folder in my hand. It was physically just as thick as it had been when I walked in, but it felt incredibly light. The crushing weight of having to constantly prove my worth, the suffocating burden of fighting for my own stolen voice, was completely gone. The profound poetry of the resolution hit me as I walked toward my car. The man who had leaned back in his leather chair and laughed directly in my face when I handed him my resignation was the exact same man who was just hauled out of the building in disgrace. He thought he held all the strings, completely unaware that I had already turned them into the very trap that brought him down. Meanwhile, the quiet woman he thought he could effortlessly crush had just forced a room full of the most powerful executives in the state into absolute, terrified submission. I smiled, unlocked my car, and drove away from the building, never looking back in the rearview mirror. Thank you for listening to my story. If this story resonated with you, please leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, please subscribe and like the video.